In the winter of 1998, the eastern side of Belmore City existed in a strange state of quiet decline. It was the kind of neighborhood where fluorescent convenience stores remained open all night, where trains rattled past aging apartment blocks every 20 minutes, and where people learned, over time, not to ask too many questions about the sounds they heard through thin walls after midnight. Rainwater collected in broken sidewalks. Streetlights flickered with a tired amber glow. Most residents worked late shifts, kept their heads down, and locked their doors before dark. At the center of Mercer Avenue stood Blackthorne Heights, a 12-story apartment complex built in the late 1960s. Once considered modern housing for working-class families, the building had slowly deteriorated over the decades into something colder and more isolated. The elevator frequently stalled between floors. The hallways smelled faintly of mildew and cigarette smoke. Tenants came and went with little interaction, and management rarely involved itself in the personal affairs of residents unless rent stopped arriving. Apartment 9 sat on the 9th floor at the very end of the western corridor, separated slightly from the neighboring units by a maintenance stairwell that had been permanently locked years earlier. Residents often described the apartment as unusually quiet. Not empty quiet, but restrained quiet, as though sound itself hesitated there. The tenant living inside was 28-year-old Evelyn Carter, a hospital transcriptionist who worked irregular overnight shifts at Belmore Regional Medical Center. According to co-workers, Evelyn was punctual, reserved, and intensely private. She rarely attended social gatherings and avoided conversations unrelated to work. Yet those who knew her described her as observant rather than unfriendly, someone who seemed constantly distracted by thoughts she never fully expressed. Neighbors remembered seeing her return home shortly after dawn most mornings, carrying a leather satchel and a small tape recorder she used during work. She had lived in apartment 9 for just under 11 months before the events that would eventually transform the building into the subject of speculation, police scrutiny, and urban folklore. The first indication that something was wrong arrived on February 14, 1998. At approximately 2:13 a.m., Belmore Emergency Dispatch received a phone call from a woman later identified as Evelyn Carter. The call lasted exactly 47 seconds. It began in near silence, interrupted only by static and shallow breathing. Then Evelyn spoke in a strained whisper that investigators would replay hundreds of times over the following years. "He's still outside." The dispatcher asked for clarification, but Evelyn hesitated before continuing. "I don't think he wants me to leave." Her voice sounded uneven, trembling beneath controlled restraint. In the background, investigators later identified a rhythmic metallic sound occurring every few seconds. At the time, dispatchers believed it might have been interference from a damaged phone line. Others thought it resembled pipes knocking inside old walls. One retired audio analyst would later insist it sounded more like someone lightly tapping metal against glass. The dispatcher requested an address. Evelyn provided it immediately: Blackthorne Heights, apartment 9. Then, unexpectedly, she became quiet again. For nearly 12 seconds, the dispatcher heard nothing except faint static and what sounded like distant movement across a hard floor surface. Evelyn then inhaled sharply. "No, he's inside now." Those would become the final confirmed words ever spoken by Evelyn Carter. The call disconnected abruptly at 2:14 a.m. Police arrived at Blackthorne Heights 9 minutes later. Officer Daniel Ruiz and his partner, Michael Tully, were the first responders to enter the building. According to their reports, the lobby was nearly empty except for an elderly tenant asleep beside a vending machine near the mailboxes. The elevator was malfunctioning, forcing officers to use the stairwell. Ruiz later described the climb as unusually unsettling, though he struggled to explain precisely why. The 9th-floor hallway appeared silent and dimly lit, with only one overhead fluorescent light functioning near apartment 9. The apartment door was closed. There were no signs of forced entry, no shouting, no movement inside. Officer Ruiz knocked several times and announced police presence. Receiving no response, the officers entered using a master key provided by the building superintendent who had arrived moments earlier. What they discovered inside apartment 9 would become the foundation of a mystery that remains unresolved nearly 3 decades later. The apartment itself appeared strangely untouched. A kettle still sat warm on the stove. The living room lamp remained on beside an open paperback novel. Evelyn's coat hung neatly beside the front entrance. Yet there were also details that immediately disturbed investigators. One dining chair lay overturned near the hallway. A drinking glass had shattered beside the kitchen sink. Most notably, the apartment telephone rested disconnected on the floor beneath the living room window. Evelyn Carter was gone. There was no blood in the apartment. No visible signs of struggle severe enough to indicate violent abduction. Windows remained locked from the inside. The chain lock on the front door had not been engaged. Detectives initially considered the possibility that Evelyn had fled voluntarily after experiencing psychological distress, though that theory weakened rapidly once they began examining the timeline surrounding the emergency call. The dispatcher insisted Evelyn sounded terrified, but coherent. Officers noted no indications of intoxication or hallucination inside the apartment. Her wallet, keys, identification, and winter coat remained behind. More troubling still was the discovery made by forensic technicians several hours later. Near the hallway leading toward the bedroom, investigators identified a series of partial shoe impressions pressed faintly into the apartment carpet. The prints did not match Evelyn's footwear. They appeared larger, consistent with a men's size 11 boot, though the impressions lacked enough detail for definitive identification. Curiously, the tracks ended abruptly 3 feet from the bedroom doorway as though the individual wearing them had simply vanished mid-step. Detectives initially withheld that detail from the public. Within 48 hours, rumors spread throughout Blackthorne Heights. Tenants spoke about hearing noises inside ventilation shafts late at night. One resident claimed she saw a tall figure standing motionless near the 9th-floor stairwell 2 nights before Evelyn disappeared. Another insisted he heard a woman arguing with someone in the hallway around midnight, though he could never distinguish the second voice. Yet the deeper investigators looked into Evelyn Carter's life, the stranger the circumstances became. Coworkers revealed Evelyn had recently complained about receiving silent phone calls at odd hours. She reportedly told a colleague that someone had been watching her from across the street outside the hospital parking structure. At first, these concerns were dismissed as anxiety caused by exhaustion from overnight shifts. But investigators later recovered handwritten notes inside Evelyn's apartment documenting dates, times, and brief descriptions of incidents she found suspicious. February 2nd. Man in gray coat outside laundromat. February 5th. Breathing on phone again. February 9th. Someone standing near maintenance stairs. The final entry was written less than 6 hours before the emergency call. He knows when I'm alone now. Detectives never identified who he referred to. As media attention intensified, Belmore police faced growing pressure to produce answers. Search teams combed nearby alleyways, abandoned buildings, drainage tunnels, and rail yards surrounding Mercer Avenue. Divers searched the river running beneath the Eastern Train Bridge. Nothing connected to Evelyn Carter was ever recovered. Then, 3 weeks after her disappearance, the case took another disturbing turn. At approximately 11:47 p.m. on March 8th, a night security guard working inside Blackthorne Heights reported hearing a telephone ringing from apartment 9. This immediately alarmed management because police had disconnected the apartment's phone line during evidence collection weeks earlier. The unit itself remained sealed pending further investigation. The guard initially ignored the sound, but according to his statement, the ringing continued for nearly 4 consecutive minutes without stopping. Eventually, he rode the elevator to the 9th floor and approached the apartment corridor. The ringing stopped the moment he reached the door. Then came a sound he would later describe with visible discomfort during questioning. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the apartment interior. The guard fled downstairs and contacted police immediately. When officers reopened apartment 9 that night, they found nothing disturbed inside. Dust remained undisturbed across the living room floor. Windows remained locked. No evidence suggested anyone had entered the apartment since it was sealed. Yet investigators could not explain the ringing telephone. Phone company records later confirmed no active service existed on the line at the time. By the summer of 1998, public fascination surrounding apartment 9 had escalated into obsession. Local newspapers published competing theories almost weekly. Some believed Evelyn had been targeted by a stalker who carefully manipulated the crime scene. Others suspected police corruption or investigative incompetence concealed key evidence from the public. A smaller, more unsettling theory emerged among residents of Blackthorne Heights itself. Several tenants began claiming Evelyn Carter was not the first unexplained disappearance connected to the building. and buried deep within decades-old property records. Investigators would eventually uncover a forgotten incident from 1971 involving another tenant from the exact same apartment. The records dated back nearly 27 years before Evelyn Carter's disappearance, buried beneath maintenance reports and ownership transfers that few investigators had considered relevant during the initial stages of the case. In October of 1971, a tenant named Leonard Vale vanished from apartment 9 under circumstances disturbingly similar to those surrounding Evelyn's final hours. Vale was a 36-year-old night janitor employed by the City Transit Authority, described by neighbors as quiet, solitary, and deeply routine-oriented. According to archived police summaries, he had contacted building management repeatedly during the weeks leading up to his disappearance, insisting someone was entering his apartment while he slept. At the time, those claims were dismissed as paranoia aggravated by insomnia and alcohol abuse. Yet several details in the old reports immediately caught investigators' attention. Vale had also complained about hearing noises inside the walls late at night. He claimed someone stood outside his apartment door for hours without knocking. Most unsettling of all was a statement documented by an officer responding to a welfare check only 4 days before Vale disappeared. According to the report, Leonard Vale repeatedly told police, "Whoever it is never comes in while I'm looking at the door." On the night he vanished, neighbors reported hearing a telephone ringing continuously inside apartment 9 sometime after midnight. By morning, Vale was gone. No signs of forced entry were discovered. His wallet remained on the kitchen table beside an unfinished cup of coffee. Investigators at the time concluded he likely abandoned the apartment voluntarily, though no financial activity, travel records, or confirmed sightings ever surfaced afterward. The discovery of the 1971 incident dramatically altered the direction of Evelyn Carter's case. Detectives began considering the possibility that the disappearances shared a common offender, someone connected to Blackthorne Heights over an extended period of time. But that theory presented its own problems. Nearly 3 decades separated the two cases. Building ownership had changed twice. Hundreds of tenants had moved through the complex over the years. Any suspect capable of maintaining proximity to apartment 9 across that length of time would likely need some enduring connection to the property itself. Attention eventually shifted toward the building's maintenance history. During renovations conducted in the early 1980s, portions of Blackthorne Heights had undergone structural modifications after repeated complaints involving water damage and electrical failures. Blueprints recovered from city archives revealed something unusual hidden behind the walls surrounding apartment 9. An inaccessible maintenance corridor, originally intended for utility access, extended behind several ninth-floor units before terminating directly beside Evelyn's bedroom wall. The corridor had supposedly been sealed decades earlier following a small electrical fire. Investigators requested immediate access. When workers finally broke through the old maintenance entrance near the western stairwell, they uncovered a narrow passage coated in dust and darkness, barely wide enough for a person to move through sideways. Rusted pipes lined the walls. Condensation dripped steadily from the ceiling. The air inside smelled stale and metallic, untouched for years. Then flashlights illuminated something unexpected. Fresh footprints. The impressions led investigators through the narrow corridor toward a ventilation opening positioned directly behind the bedroom wall of apartment 9. Detectives discovered cigarette butts, food wrappers, and several empty water bottles scattered nearby. More disturbing was the condition of the vent itself. The metal screws securing it had been loosened repeatedly over time from the inside. Someone had been using the passage recently. For the first time since Evelyn disappeared, investigators possessed evidence strongly suggesting another person had occupied hidden spaces within the building itself. The possibility transformed the case from an unexplained disappearance into something far more calculated and deeply invasive. Yet despite the significance of the discovery, the investigation once again stalled. No fingerprints recovered from the corridor matched existing records. DNA analysis remained limited by the forensic technology available in 1998. Surveillance cameras inside Blackthorne Heights were virtually non-existent, and tenant interviews produced contradictory timelines that investigators struggled to verify. Some residents insisted they occasionally heard movement inside walls late at night. Others denied anything unusual entirely. Fear and rumor gradually contaminated witness statements until separating fact from imagination became increasingly difficult. Months passed. Then, in November of 1998, nearly 9 months after Evelyn vanished, detectives received an anonymous package delivered to Belmore Police Headquarters. Inside was a single cassette tape. No return address. No fingerprints. The tape contained approximately 23 minutes of audio, most of its silence interrupted by faint environmental noise. Investigators initially believed it was a hoax until forensic technicians enhanced the recording and isolated several distinct sounds buried beneath the static. Footsteps, a creaking pipe, the distant hum of fluorescent lights, and a woman's voice. The voice strongly resembled Evelyn Carter. At first, the words were difficult to understand, almost drowned beneath interference. But as technicians cleaned the audio, certain fragments became clearer. He keeps listening. A pause followed. He said nobody notices the spaces between walls. Then, several minutes later, another sentence emerged that would haunt investigators for years afterward. He's been here longer than I thought. Police never released the full recording publicly. Portions leaked through local media over time, fueling speculation across Belmore City and beyond. Amateur investigators became obsessed with the hidden corridor theory. Some believed a maintenance worker had secretly lived inside inaccessible sections of Blackthorne Heights for years, observing tenants undetected. Others theorized Evelyn had discovered something inside the building that made her a target. But despite growing public attention, no arrests were ever made. By the early 2000s, Blackthorne Heights itself had developed a near-mythical reputation. Vacancy rates increased dramatically as residents moved away. Stories circulated about unexplained sounds inside ventilation shafts and shadowy figures appearing briefly in empty corridors before disappearing. Whether those stories reflected genuine experiences or collective paranoia remains impossible to determine. What is certain is that Apartment 9 remained permanently unoccupied after Evelyn Carter's disappearance. In 2004, city officials ordered Blackthorne Heights demolished following years of structural deterioration and declining occupancy. Demolition crews reportedly refused to work beyond sunset after several unsettling incidents inside the building. One operator claimed he heard knocking noises coming from sealed interior walls moments before part of the western corridor collapsed unexpectedly. Another worker later stated that during demolition of the 9th floor, crews uncovered additional hidden crawl spaces absent from official blueprints. No evidence connected to Evelyn Carter was ever recovered from the site. Today, the lot where Blackthorne Heights once stood has been converted into a fenced parking structure beside Mercer Avenue. Most people passing through Belmore City no longer remember the building or the woman who vanished inside it. Police officially classify the case as unresolved, though active investigation has long since faded into archival storage and fragmented memory. Still, certain details continue to disturb those familiar with the case. The disconnected phone line that rang weeks after Evelyn disappeared. The footprints ending abruptly inside the apartment. The hidden corridor concealed behind decades-old walls. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the final sentence recovered from the anonymous cassette tape. A sentence investigators rarely discussed publicly because of how strangely calm Evelyn sounded when she said it. I don't think he ever planned to leave. Nearly 3 decades later, no one knows exactly what happened inside Apartment 9 during the early morning hours of February 14, 1998. Whether Evelyn Carter encountered a predator who exploited the hidden architecture of Blackthorne Heights, or whether something even more psychologically complex unfolded behind those walls, remains uncertain. The evidence tells fragments of a story, but never the entire truth. Like many unresolved disappearances, the mystery survives not because of what investigators discovered, but because of what they never could explain. And somewhere beneath the noise of forgotten city streets and demolished buildings, the final call from Apartment 9 continues to echo unanswered. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and like for more true crime mysteries and atmospheric investigations like this one.